What's up, guys? I'm Laura from Reading in Bed, and today we're going to talk about Canada Reads because it's the Friday before Canada Reads. It starts on Monday and it runs through Thursday of next week, the last week in March. So I'm going to tell you a bit about what it is for those of you outside of Canada or even in Canada who don't follow it, and then I'm going to talk about some of the books that are going to be up for discussion and debate this year. So, what is important to know about Canada Reads? It is basically kind of like those one book, one community events where it's trying to get, everyone in a particular city or province or state or whatever to read one book, just taken to the national scale. So essentially it is trying to find out what is the one book Canada should read in any given year. It is put on by our public broadcaster here in Canada, CBC, and it first appeared on radio only in 2002. By 2004, they were also broadcasting on TV, and of course, today you can stream it and podcast it and all of that. And it's important to know that it started in the early 2000s because the vibe of this show is kind of a weird mix of Survivor and Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And then like a little bit of Hollywood Squares thrown in. So Survivor, because the premise is very much like Survivor, where you have a group of panelists, each representing a book, and they vote each other out until there's only one remaining, and all of the dramatics and strategic voting and alliances that go along with that. And then it's like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, because it's like in this sort of dark and dramatic studio, and there's a lot of dramatic music and pauses, and just like the cheesy over the topness of it is very like early Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And then the Hollywood Squares thing is just because the panelists tend to be these like B and C list celebrities. And if you're outside of Canada, you better downgrade that a few letters. They're really more public figures than celebrities. So it's a weird mix of like these very early reality TV show tropes. But like legit literary awards, they do announce a long list followed by a short list. So that lets the rest of us kind of read along and keep up, and then hopefully be really invested by the time the actual show airs. Now, if you're outside of Canada, the one reason you may have heard of this show is because it was hosted for many years by Jian Ghomeshi, who, for obvious reasons, is no longer hosting it. And since then, they've sort of cycled through a few different hosts, and I don't think they've really found the right fit or the right vibe yet, so, we'll see. Let's see. So, yeah, I mean, the general premise and the way the show works hasn't changed much over the years, but what has changed is the criteria or the theme of like what kind of one book are they supposed to choose for Canada to read every year. In years past, they didn't really have specific themes other than just that one book Canada should read. And then they tried doing different things. Like one year they did an all nonfiction year. One year they had each book represented a different region of Canada. But in the last couple of years, it's really moved towards a social justice kind of a thing, where it's like which book best holds up a particular social justice theme and will make people like think about that. So I'll just read to you what the themes have been, starting with 2014. It was A Novel to Change Our Nation. In 2015, it was One Book to Break Barriers. In 2016, it was Starting Over. That was a weird one. In 2017, it was The Book Canadians Need Now, and this year's theme, 2018, is One Book to Open Your Eyes. So apart from Starting Over, like the other four are very similar, and basically it starts to become more of an argument about which social justice issue is more important rather than which book is better. And it's unfortunate because obviously books can do both. Books can examine historical and contemporary social justice issues and themes and be really good. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And it seems like in recent years, Canada Reads has become a lot more of just like, well, let's argue about whether climate change is more important than racism, which is just a stupid argument. They're both important. We can talk about both of them. We can care about both of them. And a book can still be shit, even if it's talking about one of those themes. So, with that in mind, I'll just read out really quickly the 5 books that are going to be debated next week, and then I'm going to tell you about the 3 I've read. So there's The Boat People by Sharon Balla. It's one of the ones I have. There's Precious Cargo by Craig Davidson, which is a nonfiction. There's The Merrill Thieves by Cherie Demeline, which is a YA novel. There's American War by Omar El Akkad, which is a novel. And there's Forgiveness by Mark Sakamoto, which is a memoir. So I'm going to talk about the 3 books out of those that I've read in order of how much I like them, starting with the worst, and actually that's the one I don't have on hand. But American War. Okay, that's the first one we're going to talk about. It is a novel. It is set in 2074 to about 2095, so it's kind of like near future. And in this near future, there have been several climate disasters which have like completely annihilated the coast of North America, like both East and West Coast and Florida, and like it's just all gone. So like a massive inward migration of people has happened, and America is in a second civil war between the North and the South. It's kind of like the climate change thing kicked it off. The South refused to stop using fossil fuels, and now they're just like in this entrenched civil war, and there's like, there's refugee camps, there's all sorts of like terrorist activity, but it's like a legit war too between these two factions. So, this book, like the premise is really interesting because depending what age you are, this is a future that you are probably going to experience. If you're my age, it's like, yeah, I could be alive in 2074. I'd be really old, but I still might be here. If you're younger, yeah, you're going to be there. And it's what Margaret Atwood defines as a speculative fiction, where this is not science fiction. This could happen. Climate change could decimate the coast within 50 years. There could be a second civil war in the United States. None of it is that far-fetched. So, and that makes it really scary, and it makes the premise really grab you. When I told people about this book, they all seemed really interested. Like, oh wow, that sounds so topical and interesting. It was written pre-Trump, but I mean, yeah, like the timing couldn't be better for this book, right? But the problem is the book kind of sucks. It's full of exposition. It uses a framing device that just like doesn't really work very well. It often relies on just ridiculous coincidences that would never happen in real life. You know, people randomly meeting after years and years of not being in contact, and like just, meeting up at just the right moment for the plot to move forward. And it's just ridiculous and unbelievable. There's a lot of gratuitous torture and violence, but the most egregious thing to me is that the author really rams the themes down our throats, and it's not that I disagree with the themes or don't think they're interesting. Quite the contrary, I think they're very interesting. But I have one quote I'm going to read you. So this is our heroine. Her name is Sarat, and at this point she's 12 years old. She's living in a refugee camp. She's been caught up in this civil war and everything that's going on. So this is from her perspective. But somewhere deep in her mind, an idea had begun to fester. Perhaps the longing for safety was itself just another kind of violence, a violence of cowardice, silence, submission. What was safety, anyway, but the sound of a bomb falling on someone else's home? Okay, so like obviously this is one of the themes and messages the author's trying to get across, but rather than get it across by like writing a good book and having it come out through the plot and through the characters and through the writing, he tells us that these are the thoughts of a 12-year-old girl. And it's like, no, they're not. Okay, like it's just completely unbelievable, and obviously like it's just like it's insulting to the intelligence of the reader, honestly. Write a story, write a book that can lead me to that conclusion on my own. Trust me as a reader to get that, and don't have a 12-year-old tell it to me. And also Canada is not in this book. Like, apart from America being in the title, like literally Canada just doesn't seem to exist. It's like this big black hole. We have characters, escaping to Alaska and like getting there by boat, so they just completely bypass Canada. And there's like no mention of how Canada fits into this new world order, and it's just like really bizarre. So this book, for all those reasons and more, I do not want to see this book win Canada Reads. That would just, I don't see it happening, hopefully. The second book I read was The Boat People by Sharon Bella. So this book, it got off to a rocky start with me where it was almost committing some of those same literary crimes that American War was. There was a lot of exposition, and a lot of messages being conveyed in a very obvious manner. But eventually it got better, it got more nuanced, and I really liked the ending. So this book is much more rooted in contemporary reality. It is about a real life event that happened where a literal boatload of people from Sri Lanka, refugees from that civil war, arrived by boat in Vancouver in 2010. Although one of the odd choices this author made in The Boat People is she used all the details, all the real stuff that happened, but she made the boat arrive in 2009. And I think it's just so she could have the irony and contrast of the Vancouver Olympics happening in February 2010 while the refugees were being held captive, basically. So it's Vancouver's welcoming the world on the one hand, but, incarcerating innocent people and children on the other. Whereas in real life, that boat arrived in August of 2010. The Olympics were over. That, it wasn't that long ago, I remember, and it was bugging me, so I Googled it, and yeah, so it's just an odd choice to make everything so realistic, but then manipulating that one detail, which I mean, it's fine. It's fiction. I'm not mad about it. It's just kind of weird. And this book is told from 3 points of view. One is one of the people who was on the boat, one of the refugees. One is from one of the lawyers representing them, who also has Sri Lankan and Tamil heritage and has to kind of grapple with her identity as Canadian versus identifying with the refugees. And then one is the adjudicator, or one of the people sitting in judgment and deciding what happens to these people. And she is of Japanese Canadian heritage, and so her family was interned during World War II, and so she has to think about what happened to her family versus what is happening to these people. And yeah, so like I said, there were some issues, especially early in the book, but as it went on, it did get better. And this book, while I didn't love it, I would be okay with it winning Canada Reads because it is a good read. It's well written, and it speaks to issues, which is what they're looking for in Canada Reads. So that's The Boat People by Sharon Bella. And finally, I read The Merrill Thieves by Cherie Demeline. So this, in case it's not obvious, this is the book that I want to win Canada Reads. And this is, how do I describe this? It has a lot more in common with American War in a way, because it is set in sort of a near future, maybe 50-ish years in the future, in a Canada that has been decimated by climate change disasters, and where the government seems to have broken down or just basically devolved into military rule and that kind of thing. But it moves from that kind of speculative fiction space into a real sci-fi, because the whole premise here is that there's some weird disease or disorder that's sweeping the land. People cannot dream anymore, and so this is messing with their heads. Obviously, people are committing suicide. People are, having all sorts of mental health issues because they can't sleep and they can't dream. And somehow, people have figured out that the only cure to this is made out of the bone marrow of Indigenous people. So as a premise, it's weird, and it's not really explained in any way that is, that goes any length towards explaining how this was discovered, or why it is, or what exactly is happening. But that's actually good, because I think if they had gone too far into trying to explain every little thing about this and make it hyper realistic like they did in American War, it would have fallen flat. But because the book just focuses on the Indigenous people that are resisting this and that are trying to evade the authorities, basically, that are rounding up Indigenous people and bringing them to these centers and basically harvesting their bone marrow. It just focuses on the people resisting that and their relationships with each other. it's okay. Like, it works as a way of looking at colonization and looking at the legacy of residential schools without getting too bogged down in those details and like making it super realistic and science fiction-y. And yeah, the strength of this book is the relationships, and it's not done in a simple way. Like, Indigenous people in this book are not a monolith. There's different nations represented, different parts of Canada, because people are just, like, everyone's displaced, and they're like basically just living in the bush and trying to evade the people that are trying to round them up. And without getting too much into spoilers, it really highlights like how elders and children and like people of different ages relate to each other, and it also really highlights how important language is. And if you know anything about the legacy of residential schools in Canada, that was a big one, that people's language was taken from them. Children were beaten if they spoke their own Indigenous languages, and everyone was forced to learn English or French. And like, we're still feeling the effects of that today. And in this book, we see characters like slowly trying to take that back, and the effects it has on them as they do start to live more in their own language. And it's not about blood quantum, and it's not about being a status Indian versus not. It's not about treaties. It's really about relationship, and it's about language, and that is the strength of this book. Now, the strength this book has in terms of the Canada Reads competition, I believe, is that because it's a YA novel, actually, despite all the nuance that's going on there, I think it can be defended quite effectively against some of the arguments that have been made against other Indigenous novels in recent years. Arguments like that they're not accessible, they're like too difficult, too literary, and that they're too, like, they're downers, basically. I heard both of those mentioned against recent Canada Reads candidates like Birdie and The Break. And on the basis of this being a YA book means that it is accessible. It's quite easy to read while still being well written, and it's hopeful. It's there are moments in this book that will tear your heart out, but somehow it remains very hopeful in tone. And I think both of those are, that kind of fits in with the YA genre, right? Like, it's easy for anyone to pick this up and get into it, and it's you're gonna come out of it with that glimmer of hope, I guess. So not only do I think this is deserving of winning Canada Reads, I think it actually has a fighting chance, which is really exciting. So let's see, I think that's all I wanted to say. This is already quite long, so I'm gonna sign off now, and tune into Canada Reads. I'll put all the links for that below. Thank you for watching.